James Madison. You've definitely heard him called the father of the Constitution, right? It's pretty much his official title, something we've all learned in history class. But today, we're going to dig into some scholarship that asks a really interesting question. Does that title actually tell the whole story? So let's peel back some of those layers and see what the history really tells us.
I mean, for over a century, this has been the story. It was summed up perfectly back in 1913 by the historian Max Farrand, who called Madison the master builder. That single idea has pretty much shaped our entire understanding of how the country was founded.
But what if it's not? What if this powerful, long-held myth, as some scholars are now arguing, is actually a pretty serious distortion of what happened? And that brings us to a fascinating concept that legal scholars have dubbed the other Madison problem. It's a direct challenge to the whole narrative we thought we knew. Okay, so what is this other Madison problem? Well, it's basically the idea that we've just accepted Madison's role as the main architect of the Constitution without really questioning it. And the argument is that by putting him on this pedestal, we've ended up obscuring the massive contributions of other people, which gives us a kind of skewed picture of how it all went down in Philadelphia. So let's deconstruct this whole paternity claim, piece by piece. We'll start with the big one, the idea that Madison showed up to the Constitutional Convention way more prepared than anybody else. Now check this out. The myth is that Madison's research beforehand made him the smartest guy in the room. But the counterargument points out that this totally overlooks the insane amount of practical experience other delegates had. Think about it. Benjamin Franklin had been a world-famous diplomat and legislator for decades. George Washington had just led the entire Continental Army to victory. This was not a room of amateurs waiting for Madison to give them a history lesson. They had lived it.
Okay, you might be thinking, but what about the Virginia Plan? Wasn't that Madison's blueprint for the whole thing? And yeah, that's another cornerstone of the Madison myth. But when you look closer, that story gets a lot more complicated too.
Turns out, it was a much more collaborative story. The Virginia Plan wasn't just Madison's brainchild cooked up in his study. It was introduced by Virginia's governor, Edmund Randolph, and it came out of discussions with the entire Virginia delegation. And, this is crucial, historians think there was major input from the Pennsylvanians too, especially the legal powerhouse James Wilson. It was a team effort, for sure. And this gets to a really critical point. It's one thing to propose an idea, but it's a whole other thing to actually get that idea into the final document. So, whose ideas actually won out at the convention? It's pretty wild, but some of Madison's most important, most fundamental ideas were just flat out rejected. He was absolutely obsessed with giving the national government a federal negative, basically a veto over any state law. The convention said no way. He also fought tooth and nail for proportional representation in the Senate and refused to compromise. And guess what? He lost that fight too. And his actual influence can kind of be seen in the committee assignments. When it was time to form the Committee of Detail, and this is the super important group that wrote the first actual draft of the Constitution, Madison was passed over. They chose other guys for that incredibly important job. And this table really shows you who those other key players were. You've got James Wilson and Governor Morris, who were the main draftsmen. They wrote a ton of the actual language. We've already talked about Edmund Randolph. And then there's Roger Sherman, who was central to the Great Compromise that Madison had hated so much. These were the real architects at the drafting table. Now, this whole rethinking of Madison's role at the convention doesn't exist in a bubble. It's actually part of a much bigger, ongoing re-examination of his entire life and legacy, which forces us to look beyond 1787 and grapple with the full complexity of the man himself. Historians today are just digging so much deeper. They're asking tougher questions and trying to understand these figures in their full context, not just as brilliant political thinkers, but as whole, complicated people living in a really complex and often contradictory world. And a really powerful example of this is happening right now at Montpelier, Madison's own plantation home. Researchers there are doing the vital, difficult work of uncovering the full story of the hundreds of people that he and his family enslaved. This work is called the Naming Project, and the goal is to move beyond just abstract numbers on a page and to actually recover the individual identities, the names, and the histories of the people whose labor built Montpelier and sustained the Madison family. This is Jason. We know from records that in 1803, he was the one tasked with taking Madison's young stepson to boarding school and delivering horses all the way in Washington. This is Judy. She was the mother of a man named John, who, along with Judy's 5 other children, was given to James Madison as a gift from his father. And this is Charity. Her name shows up on tax records for just 3 years, from 1782 to 1784. And after that, she vanishes from the historical record completely.
Jason, Judy, Charity, their stories and the stories of hundreds more, they add this incredibly profound and absolutely necessary dimension to how we understand James Madison's complete legacy. It's a legacy that is so much more complex than a simple title like Father of the Constitution could ever capture.
Which leaves us with a huge question, right? When we look past the myths and start to see the founders not as gods carved in marble, but as complex, real people with brilliant ideas, yes, but also deep flaws, who are part of a huge community of thinkers and laborers, both free and enslaved, how does that change the way we see the nation they built? And maybe more importantly, how does it change how we see the nation we live in today?